I think Dr. Sharma had contributed to a paper maybe 2 years ago, and it was about how the research community needs their drill down dashboard. Well, this is, we think, the application that will ultimately realize that dream of making an MLN drill down dashboard tool. But first, it just needs to have basic user functionality, allow users to log in, log out, upload and download files, run analysis, run generation, the basic MLN stuff. So this repository, you can find it right now. It's on my GitHub account, and when it's stable, I'll move it to the IT Lab account. Niall worked along with me on one of the web pages, and David has contributed to one of the applications that are accessible in this repository. So the core architecture, it's a full stack application. Users manage their files, run experiments, and get visualizations. They should be able to use this application on various platforms, and they should have an accessible interface across all of them. On the back end, the server should perform the actual application logic, like the MLN analysis, MLN generation, or generate those interactive visualizations. This application involved using many different frameworks and integrating them together. So I started with the React framework, and that allows you to write JavaScript and HTML together. It makes it convenient to have your code and your view logic side by side. Along with React, I used the Mantine component library for high-level user interface. And occasionally I used the stylized cascading style sheets for the CSS. For the middleware and backend, I used Next.js, Prisma for database ORM management, Nextauth for authentication and credential authentication management, and SendGrid for sending emails. And then finally for development, my team, David and Niall and I, we all use GitHub to collaborate with the Git repository. We three use VS Code, but that's just an independent decision. And I use GitHub Copilot to accelerate my development. So when it came to selecting the front end frameworks, there were a lot of options. Besides Mantine, React, and the different versions of CSS, there was also the MUI library, Material UI, the Preact framework, which is a lighter weight version of Mantine and MUI, but it's so lightweight that it's actually doesn't even have really the core functionality that I needed. And then there's also the Vue framework I'd used before, so I had thought about using Vue, but I didn't like it because it didn't allow me to have my view and my code logic side by side. So I ended up selecting Mantine and React and Sass for the front end. For the middle end, I chose these four frameworks because of how they integrated together. They don't actually integrate, like, they're not designed to integrate with each other, but they're flexible enough that they're easy to integrate with each other, as opposed to other solutions like the LAMP framework, which is a traditional way of making a web server using Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Or the mean stack, which is still more modern, but it's becoming traditional compared to more modern approaches for static websites. And the mean stack, what it is it uses Mongo database, Express web server, Angular templating, and Node.js for the glue logic. I didn't use the mean framework because it wasn't as flexible and as current as the Next.js and Prisma combined are. And then, I'm sorry. And then I originally had wanted to use Firebase. I had experience using Firebase with my other work and with other mobile apps that I made for school projects. But Dr. Sharma, he recommended against Firebase because we wanted to actually build the web server ourselves. So that would kind of be defeating the purpose of making a web server if I was just to use a backend provided by another provider. Now, when it came to actually the storing the data, we originally were going to just store data in JSON files. And JSON files are a very flexible, very simple way to store data. And they're actually so flexible, you can just load a JSON file as a JavaScript object. And that's what JSON stands for, a JavaScript object notation. And so if I wanted to just store a user database, I would literally write users equals forward list bracket, and then all my users, and then backwards list bracket. And I could just serialize that to a file and then deserialize it, which is a very simple way to store data. But it has the problem that it doesn't have any type information attached to it. And it cannot manage foreign keys like a real database can. So if I wanted to call user.organization.owner.email, you can't do that without having to make a bunch of glue to duct tape together all of those different components. Prisma allows you to handle that, and it also automatically creates TypeScript bindings for the backend database structure. I used SQLite with the Prisma bindings, but I can change that later if I want to my SQL or MongoDB or one of their other 6 supported backends. For sending emails, this one was a lot of experimentation because I didn't really even know much about how an email is sent. And so what I learned is that you have to communicate with a mail transfer agent to send an email. And there were 3 solutions I looked at. There was SendGrid, which I ultimately selected. There was the SSMTP classic Linux library for sending mail to a mail transfer agent. And there was also the Node Mailer, which it has tutorials explaining how to use, but I was never able to get Node Mailer to work. So just because of what worked and what didn't work, I chose SendGrid. Although SendGrid does have a free limit of 10,000 emails per month, I don't think we're going to reach that. So that should be fine. When it came to organizing the code, I organized it under these major folders: the docs folder, public, research, source, storage, test, and then I had some top-level files. So the source folder contained the core code base for this application, the core logic, the stuff that really should get the most development attention. And inside the source, there's the applications folder for the actual business logic applications. When David wrote his MLN analysis code, he uploaded it to the apps folder. So all the apps that we have in this web application, they're each going to be in their own subdirectory under the apps folder. The backend data storage is stored in the storage folder for user files. For example, there'll be like a Dr. Sharma folder, a Jacob folder, a Nile folder, a different folder for each user under the storage directory. And then the Prisma folder, which defines the database schema and the seeding commands for the SQLite database. The backend logic is implemented in the API routes and also in the server folder. And the API routes, they look just like web pages. For all practical purposes, they are, except instead of returning HTML, they return a JSON response, which is usually an OK response, hopefully an OK response. Front-end logic is implemented in the components folder for reusable components, the pages folder for entire pages that are sent to the client, the styles folder where the SAS and SCSS style sheets are stored, and the public folder for public assets like the favicon or other images that you don't need to put behind any barriers. And finally, the common folder is common code that's used by both the front end and the back end. Examples are like the app types. The same type for user is used in the front end and the back end. Every user has a name, an image, an email, and they might have a password, or they might have an OAuth connection. So that those types don't need to be redefined for both the client and for the server. Another example are constants. All the constants for this application, like the URL, the title, they're stored in the constants folder. Outside the source directory, I have the tests folder with TS Mocha tests, and these are currently being developed, so they're not working right now, but I'll use TS Mocha for unit testing and perhaps for integration testing of the server. And then there's some top-level kind of open source project kind of files that you would have, a README, documentation, and relevant research for this project. So you can see that this is a very complex application, and it was so complex that there were many times I would start coding, and then I would realize that I didn't know what I was doing, and I had to get some paper out and write down what I was working on. So here's an example. When a user creates an account or when they log in either case, they need to be verified before they can visit an authenticated site page. And if they're not verified, then we should immediately redirect them to the verify email page. So this is the kind of flowchart that I would write on paper, and I had many such flowcharts for all the different API routes that are in process of being implemented or are implemented. And then another useful technique I found for structuring my development was writing out execution sequences or control flow sequences. So this is the kind of sequence I would write out, and I actually have written out a lot of these sequences in the documentation. Like a user would click the forgot password button, going from what a user did to what does the system do, what should the user do, how should the system respond, and so forth. We used Git to version control our repository, and we had multiple branches at many times. Niall has a separate branch, I have a separate branch, and then we have a main branch that we merge the stable code into. And then there are times when we'll also branch out and create additional branches for testing features. And that way we always have, I shouldn't say we always, but we most of the time have a main branch that's stable that anybody can check out and start working on. And then finally, documentation. I've written a lot of documentation in the docs folder in the form of markdown documents. And I also included this documentation in the MLN Dashboard LaTeX document on Overleaf. The course of the development, I spent most of my time learning and architecting the application. And then I spent about 1/3 of the time actually writing code. But I would go back and forth between writing code and then actually getting paper out and just thinking about what I'm writing. And right now I'm in the middle of trying to bring what I have to completion. So what I have right now is this homepage. Layout problems aren't really a big issue right now, but I'm working on making the login page and the create account page connect with the backend. And there will be more features to implement in the future, but I will thoroughly document what has been and what has not been implemented for Virage and future developers who join this project. So thank you for watching, and for more information, visit itlab.uta.edu.